Hello everyone and welcome to part 6 of the OAuth and OpenID Connect Getting Started screencast series. My name is Travis Spencer and today I'm going to talk to you about dynamic clients and metadata. In particular, we're going to look at the different aspects of metadata and how we can sign that, the things that are included in it, and how we can use it to create dynamic ad hoc networks and connections between the OpenID Connect server, the OAuth server, and its clients. We're also going to look at dynamic client registration or DCR and how we can do templatized and non-templatized registrations of new clients. We're going to talk about different authentication methods to the registration endpoint, and we're going to conclude the presentation by talking about dynamic client registration management so that those dynamic clients can update their registrations after the fact. The first thing that we want to dig deeper into is server metadata. This is a protocol defined by both OpenID Connect and OAuth as a way for clients or would-be clients to learn about the settings of the server and configure themselves in a way that they can bind to it dynamically at runtime. This information could be such things as the authorize and token endpoint. It could also be the issuer identifier, the JSON web key URI, where the server exposes keys that it uses to sign tokens. And if the server supports dynamic client registration, it could also be the registration endpoint where the client can go to register itself with that server. This information can be signed so that it can be passed around, and that allows for other scenarios besides point-to-point connections to be made to discover this metadata. To locate this information, both OpenID Connect and OAuth use well-known URIs. In the case of OpenID Connect, this will be exposed at .wellknown/OpenID configuration, and in the case of OAuth, the default is to expose this at .wellknown/OAuth authorization server. The latter is only a default, however, and other URIs can be used, including the one defined by OpenID. In OpenID, this .wellknown is also possible to prefix with another URI to support scenarios like multi-tenancy, for instance. When this is done, the actual URI that will be used is learned about by the client using OpenID provider issuer discovery. To understand more clearly how this works, let's do a demonstration using curl. So the first thing we're going to do is OpenID provider issuer discovery by going to the .wellknown/webfinger URI, and we're going to provide a query string argument of resource and giving that a value of an account URI, which is some user that we want to authenticate at an OpenID Connect server, which we don't know the entire issuer ID for. So here we've done the discovery and found out that the actual URI is this one with this particular prefix here. So we just add in this OAuth v2 OAuth anonymous and then the .wellknown and then the OpenID defined URI here of OpenID configuration. And what we're going to get back is the OpenID metadata for the OpenID server that can authenticate the resource that we provided during the OpenID provider issuer discovery. So we have here things like the signed metadata, we have the response types that it supports, information about the different endpoints and the claims that this OpenID server supports. So lots of information that the client can use. And if we make one more request real quick, just doing a head request, we can see the response headers, which include the caching information. So the client could actually even cache this metadata if it wanted to. There are two primary use cases for this metadata. The first is that the client will have a simpler time configuring itself to communicate properly with the OpenID Connect server or the OAuth server. But another very important one is dynamic client registration or DCR. In this protocol, a client will send a post request to the OpenID Connect server's registration endpoint, including information about the client application so that it will become known to the OpenID server or the OAuth server. This, at a minimum in OpenID, will include the redirect URI and a scope of OpenID. In OAuth, it could include other things like the software ID, which we'll get to in a little bit. The response of this call is going to be a client ID, perhaps some secret depending on the authentication method that the client should use, and possibly a management access token that will be used for DCRM. To see better how DCR works, let's do another demonstration using curl. First of all, we'll do a GET request to the OpenID Connect server's well-known OpenID configuration URI, looking for the registration endpoint in particular. Once we have this, we'll do a post request to that endpoint and we'll provide some JSON as input. And that JSON will include, at the very least, like we said, the redirect URI as well as the scopes that the client wants. It could also have other things like non-default grant types. It could also have the client name and contact information. It could have also other things, but for this demo, we'll keep it simple. So here we provide the scope of OpenID, and then as you see here in the response, we have different information that the OpenID Connect server registered, including the two grant types, authorization code and refresh token. It also includes the registration client URI and the access token that we're going to use to call that URI for DCRM, which we'll get to in a second. It also gives us a client ID and a client secret that we'll be able to use to do the code flow. And we can also ask for a response type of an ID token if we want one. What we just saw is an example of non-templatized dynamic client registration. In this form of registration, the input is whatever metadata the client wants to register with, and the OpenID Connect server, according to its own policy, will accept or change that input and respond with an entirely new client. The other kind of registration is templatized, where the only input is a software ID that is, in essence, a template identifier that the registering client will provide to the OpenID Connect server, and then the results will be whatever kind of metadata the OpenID Connect server is configured for that templatized client. So if the template is configured with a certain redirect URI, with certain grant types, etc., the input doesn't have to specify those. From the template identifier, those will be able to be obtained and returned to the new instance of that template. Some parts of the metadata obviously will change, like the client secret, where every instance will need a new secret, but all other metadata for all instances of that template will be the same. To understand templatized client registration more clearly, let's do another demonstration using curl. The first thing that we need to do is get an access token that will be used to authenticate to the registration endpoint. So we need the token endpoint, and we can get that from the metadata. Once we have that token endpoint, we're going to do the client credential flow, which we learned about in part 4. So here we're going to use a particular client that is allowed to register other clients, so instances of the template. So here we specify a client identifier of registration client, and we tell the server that we're doing the client credential flow. And then importantly, we specify a scope of DCR, and we pass this to the token endpoint, and we get back a new access token that is scoped for DCR. And now we can use this to register a new client. So we started with a registration client, but now we want a instance of a template. So we provide this registration access token and some input, and we send this to the registration endpoint, which we obtained from the configuration data before. So once we do that, the input that we're going to provide here, instead of the redirect URIs and the scope, instead it's going to be simply the software ID. So this is the template ID on which we want to base a new client. So we just provide a software ID here of dynamic client template, and then the response to this is going to be a bunch of different information based on that template. So the different authentication methods, the scopes that are configured for that template, the grant types that are allowed for it. So we didn't have to provide any of this in the input. Instead, the instance of this client is going to use all of this information without having to provide it as input. To make sure that it's clear exactly how that works, let's draw it up on the whiteboard. So at the beginning, we had the client here for registration, and we had the authorization server, and that had the token endpoint that we found in the metadata, and we sent a request here where we included the scope equal DCR for dynamic client registration and a grant type of client credentials. And we also included the client ID and secret of the registration client. And the response to this was an access token that is scoped for registration. And then the authorization server also had a registration endpoint. So we sent that access token to here together with a software ID equal the template ID, so our template client. And then we got back a bunch of JSON that included a new client with its associated secret, its grant types, redirect URIs and everything that was based on this template rather than having anything to do with the one that was used for registration. So what we can also do is we could also have a user involved, because in this case there's no user. So we learned about the code flow and things like that. We could also have the client, what it could do is this could be doing the code flow. So the user would be redirected over to the authorization endpoint. And the authorization endpoint would log the user in and return a code to that client. And then the client would send that to the token endpoint, and the grant type in this case would be authorization code. And it would still get back an access token scope for registration, because when doing the authorization flow on the front channel, it would include a scope of DCR. And now with this access token for registration, we would do that same registration. So this one here would be like doing implicit flow or the code flow, and figure out who the user is, and then get a new instance of a client just for that particular user. So you can think of this client that's being used for registration as sort of bootstrapping that dynamic client. So this touches on authentication and the different techniques that we can do for authenticating the registration endpoint. So let's talk about that some more. The OAuth specification doesn't say anything about how authentication to the registration endpoint should be done, and neither does OpenID. Although the OpenID Connect conformance tests do require the OpenID provider to at least support no authentication. So if the provider that you're interacting with has passed that test suite, you can at least count on it supporting no authentication. We looked at an example using the client credential flow and whiteboarded an example of a public client doing the implicit flow or code flow in order to obtain an access token before calling registration. So that's another couple of mechanisms that you could potentially use. Another is mutual TLS. In this case, commonly comes up in PSD2 and others where you have a trust anchor that could sign a client key, and the registration endpoint could allow any key signed by that trusted certificate authority to register to it. So you sort of shift away how authentication and trust of those clients is done to that provider. Let's look at this case where we authenticate the user to obtain a registration access token as we're creating a dynamic client. We'll do that using OAuth tools, and we'll perform the code flow like we've done in previous cases. Here what we'll do is we'll select that same registration client that we were using with the client credential flow. We'll pass, as I talked about on the whiteboard, the DCR scope, and we will use Pixie since this is a public client. Now we will perform the flow that will look like this in the browser. At this point, we need to log in, and my password manager has remembered my user account, so I'll just go ahead and get logged in. And after this, I now have the code that I need to redeem, which we just talked about on the whiteboard. So I'll go ahead and redeem that. And now I get an access token that is scoped for registration. So let's go ahead and use this now. So we'll call an API, and that API will be the registration API. This will be a post like we just did, and we'll provide an access token like we did before with curl. And we will include that same kind of JSON. So we need to have a software ID, and that will be our dynamic client template. So we want to make a new dynamic client based on this template using this access token that is scoped for registration and tied to the user chain. And if we look at this now, it's similar to what it is that when we did the client credential flow, where we get back information related to the template because it's an instance of that. So we have a client ID in here. We have a client secret as well that's randomly generated. And this client can do different flows, like the code flow. It can do the refresh flow. It can do implicit flow. It has a couple of different authentication methods, some redirect URIs, and it also has a registration access token and a registration URI where we can go and update that registration that we just obtained. And that's what we're going to talk about next is DCRM. In the OAuth standard, there is a way of managing clients after registration. So as we just saw in that OAuth tools example, one of the response values in the JSON is a URI where we can go to manage the registration that we've previously done for a particular client. Another part of the response is the registration access token. So when we call that API, we can provide that access token. And what we can do with this API is to update the registration. So we can do a put there to do a modification on it. If we need to get the information back, we can do a get request. And if we need to get rid of the registration, we can do a delete on that. So DCRM is basically a CRUD API for registration of dynamic clients. And that brief explanation of dynamic client registration management concludes my talk. So in summary, in this presentation, I discussed server metadata that is defined by OAuth and OpenID Connect and how we can use that to register clients with the OpenID provider and the OAuth server, and how we can use that to bootstrap or configure clients. We also did some demonstrations in both OAuth tools and curl to actually register new clients based on the template as well as non-templatized registration. We talked about different authentication mechanisms based on access tokens or other mechanisms, including mutual TLS. And we wrapped it up talking about how we could use a CRUD API in DCRM to actually update those registrations. So thanks everyone for joining me in part 6 of the OAuth screencast series. My name is Travis Spencer. It's been great to be with you again in this installment. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. Thanks for listening.